In the spring of 1945, as the Second World War approached its final months in Europe, the strategic balance had irrevocably shifted against Nazi Germany. The Red Army had advanced far beyond its pre-war borders, liberating vast swaths of Eastern Europe and setting its sights on the symbolic and strategic objectives of Central Europe. Among these, Vienna held unique significance. As the capital of Austria, annexed into the German Reich since the Anschluss of 1938, Vienna was not only a major administrative and logistical center, but also a powerful symbol of German expansion. Its location at the crossroads of Eastern and Western Europe made it a vital node in the Reich's internal communications and its last remaining bastion in the southeast. By early 1945, Austria found itself on the front line of a crumbling empire. The German Wehrmacht, depleted and demoralized, was attempting to defend a shrinking perimeter on multiple fronts. Hungary had been the site of fierce and prolonged fighting, especially around Budapest, where Soviet forces had conducted one of the war's longest sieges. With Budapest taken in February 1945, the path toward Vienna opened. Soviet High Command viewed the capture of Vienna as the logical next step in securing the Danube corridor and advancing into the heart of Europe. The offensive would also support the broader Soviet objective of reaching as far west as possible before the Western Allies. The Vienna offensive was shaped by complex geopolitical realities. While the Yalta Conference had established the basic framework for post-war occupation zones, on-the-ground military advances would heavily influence the actual distribution of power in the final days of the war. Stalin was particularly concerned about Western intentions in Austria, and was determined to ensure that Vienna, unlike Berlin, would be taken by Soviet troops. For the Soviets, victory in Vienna was not only a matter of military necessity, but also political leverage. On the German side, despite the overwhelming odds, resistance was not only expected but commanded. The Nazi regime continued to issue orders for total war, and the remnants of the Wehrmacht, bolstered by SS units and Volkssturm militia, were tasked with holding Vienna at all costs. The city was designated a fortress by Hitler, a label that implied a last stand rather than a tactical withdrawal. German military leaders, including General Rudolf von Bülow and SS General Wilhelm Bittrich, began preparing for the city's defense in anticipation of the Soviet advance. Complicating the situation further was the state of the civilian population. Vienna, once a cultural capital of Europe, had endured years of wartime austerity, Allied bombing, and Nazi oppression. As the Red Army approached, fear gripped the city's inhabitants, not only of the violence to come, but also of the uncertain future under Soviet occupation. Nazi propaganda had long warned of Soviet atrocities, fueling panic and flight. Many civilians fled westward, hoping to reach American lines, while others remained, resigned to fate. The build-up to the Vienna offensive also featured significant military redeployments. Soviet Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin's Third Ukrainian Front, having already proven its effectiveness in the Balkans and in Hungary, was tasked with spearheading the assault. Tolbukhin coordinated with Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's Second Ukrainian Front to secure flanks and protect logistical routes. These movements required substantial coordination across wide fronts, through difficult terrain, and under time pressure to preempt any German reinforcements or sabotage effort. Meanwhile, German forces began mining bridges, fortifying buildings, and establishing urban defensive positions. The Wehrmacht still possessed some mechanized units, including elements of the 6th SS Panzer Army, although these were a shadow of their former strength. Fuel shortages, loss of air cover, and the breakdown of centralized command meant that German forces increasingly relied on local initiative and the fanaticism of SS commanders. The defense of Vienna would be marked not by strategic coherence, but by desperate improvisation and last-minute fortification. As the month of March 1945 drew to a close, the Soviet advance gathered momentum. In the broader context of the war, American and British forces were crossing the Rhine, and Germany's industrial base was collapsing under relentless bombing. Austria, once the launching ground for German ambitions, was now being drawn into the war's final convulsions. The coming offensive would decide not only the fate of Vienna, but also the post-war balance of power in southeastern Europe. The stage was set for one of the Eastern Front's last major operations. On April 2, 1945, the Vienna offensive formally commenced. Soviet forces, under the command of Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin, began their initial movements across the Hungarian-Austrian border. The Third Ukrainian Front spearheaded the attack with several armies, including the 4th Guards Army and the 9th Guards Army, supported by mechanized and tank corps. Their immediate objective was to penetrate the outer defenses and advance toward Vienna from the southeast, aiming to encircle the city and sever German retreat lines. Simultaneously, Soviet armored units began probing the approaches along the Danube, moving to isolate the capital from reinforcements positioned further west. The opening days of the offensive were marked by rapid advances and sharp clashes. In Lower Austria, German forces attempted to mount a delaying action around the towns of Wiener Neustadt, Baden, and Glognitz. These towns, lying on key railway and road junctions, became focal points of resistance. The Germans utilized the rugged terrain of the Vienna woods and urban environments to slow the Soviet advance. However, the Red Army, seasoned by years of brutal combat, pushed forward relentlessly, deploying overwhelming artillery barrages and mobile infantry tactics to overwhelm German positions. Vienna itself had not been designed to withstand prolonged siege or urban warfare. While some defensive preparations had been made, such as barricading streets and converting government buildings into strongpoints, the city lacked sufficient fortifications and heavy armaments. Nevertheless, Hitler's orders to defend the city to the last man created a situation where retreat was forbidden and all resources were funneled into a doomed last stand. The SS and Volkssturm units played a leading role in these efforts, often executing civilians or regular troops accused of defeatism or sabotage. In coordination with ground operations, Soviet air forces conducted bombing raids on transportation hubs and communication lines. The goal was to paralyze the German ability to maneuver reserves and to prevent the orderly evacuation of troops or civilians. Bridges over the Danube were targeted, though care was taken to avoid excessive destruction of infrastructure, as Soviet planners anticipated the political and logistical value of a relatively intact Vienna. Despite this, intense fighting and German demolition efforts would result in significant damage to the city's transportation network. As Soviet troops drew closer, German military command became increasingly fragmented. General Oberst Lothar Rendulic, commanding Army Group South, attempted to coordinate resistance but faced insubordination from SS formations, conflicting orders from Hitler's headquarters, and the logistical impossibility of sustaining forces in a collapsing theater. The 6th SS Panzer Army, once a feared formation, now operated at a fraction of its former strength, its fuel supplies critically low and its panzer divisions reduced to scattered battle groups. On April 5th, the Red Army reached the outskirts of Vienna. Fighting broke out in the southern suburbs, including Favoriten and Meidling, where German troops had established defensive belts using barricades, anti-tank weapons, and sniper positions. House-to-house combat began in earnest. Soviet commanders prioritized speed to prevent the Germans from regrouping and to minimize opportunities for scorched earth tactics. Tank units were used in direct urban combat, supported by sappers and assault infantry who cleared buildings block by block. The civilian population, numbering over 1 million, endured immense suffering during this phase. Food and medical supplies were scarce, electricity and water were disrupted, and thousands sought shelter in cellars and underground stations. Propaganda had instilled fear of Soviet atrocities, prompting panic and even suicides among segments of the population. Yet in many cases, civilians also attempted to surrender districts or protect infrastructure, risking execution by German forces who accused them of collaboration. By April 7th, Soviet troops had entered the inner districts of Vienna. Key landmarks, including the Südbahnhof and the Arsenal complex, became scenes of fierce combat. The Wehrmacht and SS resorted to demolishing bridges and buildings to slow the Soviet tide, but their actions only added to the destruction and chaos. With the Red Army advancing from multiple axes, Vienna's defenders found themselves surrounded and gradually cut off from outside assistance. The ring around the city tightened. Inside Soviet command, there was urgency. Not only did they want to prevent a drawn-out siege, but they also aimed to secure Vienna before any potential Anglo-American advances into Austria. Though the Western Allies had no immediate plans to capture Vienna, Stalin's insistence on swift occupation reflected deeper concerns about post-war influence. Political officers embedded with Soviet troops emphasized discipline and ideological conduct, but also urged commanders to press forward at all costs. As the first week of April drew to a close, Vienna was engulfed in a chaotic and intensifying battle. The city that once represented imperial grandeur and cultural refinement had become a devastated battlefield, its fate tied to the outcome of the war and the rivalries of great powers. The streets echoed not with music, but with the roar of artillery and the cries of a people caught between retreating occupiers and advancing conquerors. The Soviet plan for the capture of Vienna relied on coordinated pincer movements designed to encircle and fragment German defenses. The 4th Guards Army attacked from the south, advancing through the industrial suburbs and targeting key transportation nodes, while the 6th Guards Tank Army maneuvered from the northeast, pressing down along the Marchfeld Plain. At the same time, the 9th Guards Army moved westward to cut off possible reinforcements arriving from St. Pölten and the Alpine regions. The Soviet High Command emphasized speed and strategic encirclement, aiming to trap the German defenders within Vienna before they could withdraw or regroup. German resistance, while increasingly desperate, was not entirely disorganized. Elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, and remnants of the 6th SS Panzer Army attempted localized counterattacks, particularly in the Floridsdorf and Simmering districts. These units, supported by anti-tank guns and what remained of Germany's dwindling armored reserves, launched sporadic offensives to delay Soviet progression. Some success was achieved in stalling specific Soviet thrusts, but these gains were short-lived. Lacking air support and outnumbered, German forces found themselves continuously falling back under relentless artillery barrages and overwhelming infantry assaults. By April 8th, Soviet troops had gained control over most of the southern and eastern suburbs. The city's dense architecture, narrow streets, and historical buildings turned the fight into a grueling urban struggle. Soviet soldiers encountered extensive booby traps, sniper nests, and fortified buildings turned into makeshift bunkers. Entire residential blocks became battlegrounds. Progress was measured in meters, and casualties mounted on both sides. Soviet commanders adopted flexible tactics, rotating assault groups and deploying sappers to clear barricades and mines. The use of flamethrowers and direct-fire artillery within the city became common. Inside the city center, the German command attempted to maintain control through draconian measures. The Gestapo and SS executed suspected deserters and civilians accused of aiding the Soviets. Martial law was enforced with brutal efficiency. Despite this, internal disintegration accelerated. Communications broke down and unit cohesion eroded as the front line moved closer to the historic center. Supplies ran low and confusion reigned in command posts. Reports of German troops surrendering without orders or abandoning positions increased, despite official orders to fight to the last bullet. The Red Army, for its part, maintained steady momentum. Marshal Tolbukin coordinated the urban offensive with precision, prioritizing the capture of logistical and governmental centers. One key objective was the central railway hub, the Westbahnhof, which linked Vienna to the western provinces and the German heartland. Heavy fighting erupted around the station, with Soviet forces eventually securing it after prolonged clashes that left the area in ruins. The loss of the station severed a critical artery of German movement and supply. In the north of the city, the Soviet advance encountered stiff resistance near the Donau Canal and the Prater Park area. German engineers had demolished bridges, attempting to isolate Soviet forces and slow the attack. However, Soviet sappers quickly constructed pontoon crossings under fire, allowing armored units to continue their push into the Leopoldstadt district. There, the fighting grew even more vicious. The proximity to the Reichsbrücke and other key crossings made the area strategically vital, and both sides threw in whatever resources they had remaining. By April 10th, the inner city was effectively surrounded. The Red Army had established control over most of the outer districts, and only a core of hardened SS units, local Volkssturm, and some Wehrmacht remnants remained entrenched within the 1st District, Vienna's historic center. With artillery positions on the heights surrounding the city, Soviet guns now shelled German strongpoints at will. Civilian casualties soared, and fires spread through old neighborhoods, consuming centuries-old buildings. Hospitals overflowed, and relief efforts were virtually non-existent. Appeals for surrender from the Soviets were ignored or blocked by the Nazi chain of command. Amid this chaos, resistance within Vienna began to take divergent form. Some Austrian citizens and disillusioned German officers attempted to negotiate surrenders or ceasefires in localized areas. These actions, while sporadic, allowed some Soviet units to bypass unnecessary bloodshed. However, such instances remained isolated. The overall German defense, dominated by SS ideology and loyalty to Hitler's orders, refused any general capitulation. Elsewhere, the Soviets continued to solidify their control over the surrounding regions. Armored columns moved to intercept any German reinforcements attempting to approach from the west, while air support suppressed movement along major roads. The Soviet strategy of complete encirclement and pressure on all fronts had succeeded. Vienna had become an island of resistance, cut off and steadily being crushed from within. The final battle for the city's core was now imminent. The Red Army had bled for every district, every block, and every building. With each day, the operational goal moved closer: complete occupation of the Austrian capital. The political stakes were equally high. Control over Vienna would not only symbolize Soviet dominance in southeastern Europe, but would also grant the USSR decisive leverage in shaping Austria's post-war future. The offensive's conclusion would come not in a sweeping maneuver, but in the brutal, methodical reduction of a city whose defenders had no path to victory. By April 11th, the Soviet encirclement of Vienna was complete. All major routes into and out of the city had been severed, and the remaining German defenders were now isolated within the heart of the Austrian capital. The Red Army initiated a methodical campaign to clear the city's center, focusing their efforts on the Innere Stadt, the historical core bounded by the Ringstrasse. This district, with its dense architecture, government buildings, and symbolic landmarks, became the stage for the final and most intense phase of the urban battle. The defenders, composed mainly of SS units, scattered Wehrmacht elements, and hastily armed Volkssturm militia, made use of Vienna's infrastructure to stage a last stand. Buildings were rigged with explosives, tunnels were fortified, and elevated positions were used to place machine guns and snipers. These tactics, combined with the defenders' fanatical resolve, significantly slowed the Soviet advance. The Soviet response was deliberate and overpowering: infantry assaults supported by close-range artillery, tanks firing point-blank into building facades, and the widespread use of sappers to neutralize booby traps and minefields. Every block turned into a self-contained battlefield. The Soviets advanced through courtyards, underground passages, and apartment interiors, clearing rooms floor by floor. Civilian casualties rose sharply as many residents had sought shelter within basements and buildings now turned into strongpoints. The famous St. Stephen's Cathedral, a landmark of Viennese identity, came under fire as nearby buildings were used for German observation posts. Though the Soviets initially attempted to avoid damage to cultural monuments, the ferocity of the fighting made such precautions difficult to maintain. Elsewhere in the city, Soviet forces had already secured vital infrastructure. The gasometers, the flak-term towers, and the bridges across the Donau Canal had fallen one by one under sustained pressure. The collapse of these positions allowed Soviet units to funnel more troops and equipment into the central districts. Particularly fierce fighting occurred around the Hofburg Palace and the Ministry's Quarter, where German officers had established command centers. The Soviet assault eventually breached these locations, scattering the defenders and capturing key government archives. The humanitarian crisis inside Vienna reached its peak. Thousands of civilians were trapped between shifting front lines. Food supplies were nearly exhausted, water systems had collapsed, and electricity was gone. Makeshift medical stations operated in cellars, treating injuries with dwindling resources and minimal hygiene. Civilian volunteers attempted to care for the wounded and bury the dead, but the scale of devastation overwhelmed all efforts. Firestorms, triggered by shelling and deliberate sabotage, consumed entire neighborhoods. Many historical and residential buildings were reduced to smoldering ruins. In this chaos, isolated cases of surrender and negotiation began to appear. Some German units, particularly those made up of conscripted Austrians or wounded personnel, attempted to lay down their arms. These localized capitulations were often accepted by Soviet officers seeking to minimize further bloodshed. However, the high command of the German defense remained inflexible. Hitler's direct orders to defend Vienna to the last prevented any official surrender, and SS commanders enforced this policy with summary executions. Despite this, the pace of the Soviet advance increased. On April 12th, the Red Army had breached the Burgtheater area and pushed past the University of Vienna. With control over the Rathaus and surrounding buildings, Soviet troops could now dominate the remaining defensive positions in the First District. Tanks rolled down historic boulevards, their treads crushing debris, rubble, and the remains of barricades. Machine gun fire echoed through the arcades and narrow streets, and the last remaining German units were slowly ground down under relentless pressure. The psychological toll on the defenders was severe. Reports emerged of entire squads deserting, SS troops abandoning positions under fire, and confusion spreading through the German command structure. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast appeals for surrender, promising humane treatment for those who laid down arms. For many defenders, these offers were the first cracks in the wall of propaganda and fear that had surrounded them. Still, the most ideologically committed factions continued to resist, forcing the Soviets to take building after building with brute force. By April 13th, Soviet troops had taken full control of the inner city. Sporadic gunfire and isolated clashes continued throughout the day, but the organized resistance had effectively ceased. The red flag was raised over the Vienna City Hall and other central landmarks. German prisoners were rounded up in courtyards and squares, while civilians emerged from shelters, exhausted, dazed, and uncertain of what would follow. The Battle of Vienna, one of the last major urban battles of the Eastern Front, was over. The cost had been immense. The city lay in ruins, its population traumatized, its infrastructure shattered. Yet the Soviet objectives had been met. Vienna, once the jewel of the Habsburg Empire and later a Nazi stronghold, had fallen. For the Red Army, it was a strategic and symbolic victory. For the German command, it was a devastating loss that signaled the total unraveling of their southern front. And for Austria, the battle marked both the end of Nazi rule and the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter under Soviet occupation. With the final collapse of organized German resistance in Vienna on April 13, 1945, the Soviet forces rapidly transitioned from combat operations to stabilization and consolidation. The immediate priority for the Red Army was securing the city against any lingering threats, including isolated enemy elements, sabotage efforts, and civil unrest. Patrols swept through the remaining districts, disarming German stragglers and locating weapons caches. Soviet military police established checkpoints at major intersections, railway stations, and government buildings. Within days, the city was firmly under Soviet control, though the atmosphere remained tense and volatile. The humanitarian situation presented a severe challenge. The population of Vienna, reduced through flight, casualties, and wartime attrition, was in a state of desperation. Food supplies had been interrupted for weeks, clean water was scarce, and medical care was virtually non-existent. Soviet field hospitals were established in repurposed schools and public buildings to treat both military and civilian wounded, though resources were stretched thin. Looting, both spontaneous and organized, emerged as a widespread issue. Some Soviet soldiers, embittered by years of brutal warfare and propaganda-fueled hatred of Germans, participated in acts of violence and retribution, further complicating efforts to restore order. Soviet command attempted to address these problems through strict discipline. and the establishment of administrative structures. Political officers were dispatched to ensure compliance with directives from Moscow and to coordinate with emerging Austrian civilian representatives. In many areas, local Viennese took the initiative to re-establish essential services, clearing rubble, restoring utilities, and organizing food distribution, often under the oversight of Soviet officers. Despite some cooperative efforts, tensions between occupiers and civilians remained high, aggravated by cultural differences, fear, and the visible presence of foreign troops in every aspect of daily life. For the German military, the fall of Vienna marked a strategic catastrophe. Army Group South, already fractured and retreating across the Alps and western Hungary, lost its last major urban stronghold in the southeast. German command structures rapidly disintegrated. Communications were severed, units dissolved under pressure, and many officers fled westward in hopes of surrendering to the Americans rather than falling into Soviet hands. Hitler, still issuing commands from the Führerbunker in Berlin, raged at the loss, but refused to authorize any strategic withdrawal that might have salvaged remaining forces. Meanwhile, the Soviet High Command interpreted the victory in Vienna not only as a military achievement, but as a political milestone. Stalin emphasized the importance of having taken the city before the Western Allies could reach it. Though U.S. forces under General Mark Clark were advancing through northern Italy and had entered western Austria, they made no effort to contest Soviet control of Vienna. The division of Austria into occupation zones had already been tentatively agreed upon at Yalta, but the timing of military advances would heavily influence the realities on the ground. With Vienna firmly in Soviet hands, the USSR gained a dominant position in shaping Austria's immediate future. Propaganda efforts quickly followed the military victory. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts hailed the fall of Vienna as a triumph of liberation, portraying the Red Army as a force of justice driving fascism from Central Europe. Posters were plastered across the city, celebrating Soviet-Austrian friendship and denouncing the Nazi regime. At the same time, security operations began targeting former Nazi officials, collaborators, and suspected war criminals. Mass arrests were carried out, and many individuals were deported to the Soviet Union for investigation or imprisonment. The NKVD established a presence in the city, overseeing political vetting and intelligence gathering. In parallel, discussions began regarding the political reorganization of Austria. The Provisional Government of Austria, led by Karl Renner, was formed in mid-April with Soviet support. Though Renner was an experienced and widely respected figure, his sudden reappearance under Soviet auspices raised concerns among Western allies. Nonetheless, the Soviets saw the re-establishment of Austrian statehood as a useful narrative device, framing their presence as liberation rather than occupation. For the Austrian population, however, the situation remained ambiguous. While the fall of Nazi rule was welcomed by many, the presence of foreign troops and the uncertainty of post-war governance created anxiety and confusion. Amid these developments, the destruction wrought by the battle was laid bare. Vienna's cultural landmarks had been scarred, though some had miraculously survived. St. Stephen's Cathedral remained standing despite nearby fire. The Opera House, damaged by bombs earlier in the war, had sustained further harm, but was not destroyed. Residential neighborhoods, particularly in the outer districts, bore the worst of the damage. Entire blocks reduced to rubble, tram lines torn apart, and public parks filled with makeshift graves. The cleanup process would take years, and the psychological impact would last much longer. For Soviet troops, Vienna represented both a victory and a moment of transition. Many had fought across Eastern Europe for months, even years. The city's fall meant not rest, but redirection. Some units were sent further west to intercept German forces in retreat. Others remained behind to secure lines of communication and assist in the occupation effort. Soldiers were decorated for bravery, commanders promoted, and battle honors awarded. Yet behind the official celebrations lay the fatigue of prolonged warfare and the anticipation of final victory in Berlin, still weeks away. The Battle of Vienna thus concluded not with a singular moment of surrender, but with the disintegration of resistance and the imposition of a new political and military reality. The The city, once a symbol of imperial grandeur and later a cog in Hitler's Reich, now stood as a crossroads between collapsing tyranny and the uncertain dawn of liberation. The Red Army had seized Vienna, but the future of Austria and of Europe remained unresolved. The Vienna offensive reached its peak intensity during the final days of fighting in early to mid-April 1945, when the Red Army's full weight was brought to bear on the city's core defensive zones. It was not a swift collapse, but a brutal grinding down of positions through sheer momentum, firepower, and human cost. The streets of Vienna became choked with rubble, burned-out vehicles, and the fallen, soldiers and civilians alike. The high command of the Soviet Third Ukrainian Front continued its push through key avenues and urban choke points with the intent of preventing any German regrouping or consolidation. Marshal Tolbukin directed operations with calculated force. Infantry units rotated rapidly to maintain combat effectiveness, and artillery was deployed in concentrated barrages to shatter entrenched positions. Soviet Katyusha rocket batteries were used to bombard remaining strongholds in the inner city, while self-propelled guns supported infantry columns moving through narrow boulevards. The Ringstrasse, once a symbol of Habsburg civic grandeur, was now reduced to a corridor of fire. Tanks rolled over tram lines and marble sidewalks alike, while sappers cleared the way of mines and barricades laid hastily by the defenders. The Germans, despite having no realistic chance of success, continued to mount fierce resistance in key locations. The Ministry of War building, the Gestapo headquarters, and the Hofburg complex were transformed into hardened redoubts. Fanatical SS detachments led last stands in the university district and inside government offices, using flame weapons, satchel charges, and sniper teams to inflict maximum casualties. Yet their capacity to organize coherent defense declined hour by hour. Many Wehrmacht officers had either fled, been killed, or simply lost control of their units. Orders often failed to reach frontline positions, and communication lines were severed by Soviet shell fire. On April 11th and 12th, Soviet troops made their final drive into the heart of the 1st District. The Vienna State Opera, already damaged from earlier bombing raids, was caught in the crossfire. The Parliament building, Ringstrasse palaces, and national museums sustained significant damage as Soviet infantry cleared each floor with grenades and bayonets. The strategy was unrelenting. Every building was to be taken and secured before moving forward. Resistance was annihilated in place. Though some defenders tried to surrender, many were killed before the order could be recognized, a consequence of the confusion and intensity of the battle. At the same time, the civilian cost became even more severe. Hundreds died daily from shelling, fires, or crossfire. Entire families perished in bombed-out apartment blocks. Cellars and subway stations were crammed with those seeking shelter, but disease and panic spread rapidly. Efforts to deliver aid or evacuate the wounded were often impossible, as even hospitals and Red Cross stations came under fire. Some civilians attempted to signal non-combatant status with white flags or improvised armbands, but these gestures were not always recognized or respected in the chaos of combat. From the Soviet perspective, this phase of the battle was crucial not only for its tactical significance, but for its political symbolism. Capturing the central institutions of Vienna sent a clear signal. The Nazi grip on Austria was finished. Soviet war correspondents embedded with the advancing forces documented the destruction and raised the red flag over key buildings. Propaganda teams filmed the storming of central squares and the reaction of local citizens, shaping a narrative of liberation and retribution. Orders from Moscow emphasized discipline, but in practice, unit behavior varied widely, and reports of looting and violence continued to emerge. Despite isolated acts of vengeance, the Red Army also carried out engineering and logistical operations during the battle's peak. Mobile bridges were constructed across the Donau Canal, allowing continuous reinforcement and supply flow. Soviet sappers cleared key intersections of unexploded ordnance. Fuel depots and munitions stocks captured from the Germans were secured or destroyed, and command posts were relocated into central administrative buildings as they were taken. The Army's operational depth allowed it to maintain momentum even amid the urban chaos. By April 13th, the battle was effectively over. pockets of resistance were eliminated, and the Soviet command declared Vienna secure. The final moments of the campaign were as violent as any before them. In the last strong points, SS troops fought to the death or committed suicide rather than surrender. In one of the final symbolic acts, Soviet troops stormed the Rathaus and hoisted the red flag above the city, a declaration that Vienna, once a prized possession of the Nazi Reich, now belonged to the victors. The casualty figures of this peak phase were staggering. The Soviets suffered thousands of dead and wounded in less than 2 weeks of city fighting. German losses were even higher, compounded by executions, desertions, and the collapse of medical services. Civilian deaths were difficult to calculate precisely, but likely numbered in the tens of thousands across the city and surrounding areas. The physical damage was vast. Over a third of Vienna's buildings were destroyed or severely damaged, infrastructure crippled, and the city's cultural and architectural heritage irreparably scarred. But the Soviet victory at its peak was absolute. Vienna had not only fallen, it had been thoroughly conquered. Its roads, bridges, and institutions were now under Red Army control. The flag flying over the battered city was not the black-white-red of Nazi Germany, nor the black and gold of the old empire, but the red banner of the Soviet Union. The battle's peak marked not just a climax of destruction, but the irreversible shift of power in Central Europe, militarily, politically, and ideologically. As the fighting in Vienna came to an end, both sides turned to adaptation and survival amid the ruins. For the Soviet forces, the immediate challenge shifted from offensive operations to consolidation, administration, and occupation. The Red Army had learned through hard experience in cities like Budapest and Warsaw that a victorious army must pivot quickly, re-establishing order, securing vital infrastructure, and confronting the chaos that followed urban combat. In Vienna, the challenge was immense. The city, physically shattered and emotionally paralyzed, required both military discipline and political strategy to stabilize. Soviet units began systematically sweeping the remaining districts, clearing any last holdouts, defusing mines, and cataloging captured material. Mobile command posts were established in key civic buildings, and Soviet engineers began urgent repairs on water mains, electric grids, and damaged transportation arteries. Though much of Vienna's infrastructure had been severely degraded, parts of it remained functional, and Soviet planners moved quickly to exploit what remained. Railway lines were restored to allow troop and supply movement, while major roads were cleared of rubble by forced labor units composed of German POWs and Austrian volunteers. In terms of resistance and countermeasures, the end of open combat did not mean the absence of conflict. Scattered bands of German troops, some unaware of Vienna's fall or operating under standing orders to resist occupation, attempted to mount guerrilla-style operations in the surrounding countryside. These groups, often composed of remnants from SS units, conducted sabotage operations against supply routes and communication lines. Soviet counterintelligence agencies, particularly the NKVD and SMERSH, responded with ruthless efficiency. Raids were conducted throughout Lower Austria, arrests were made en masse, and suspected collaborators were deported or executed following summary proceedings. In the city itself, psychological adaptation became paramount. The civilian population was caught in a complex transformation. The Nazi regime had fallen, but a new authority had taken its place. Fear was pervasive. Many Austrians had spent years immersed in Nazi propaganda, which had emphasized the barbarity of the Red Army. Now, faced with occupation, the population had to navigate a dangerous landscape shaped by both reality and myth. Some Soviet officers attempted to foster order and reassurance, organizing food distribution and offering protection to local officials who cooperated. Others acted with impunity, driven by vengeance or opportunism. Incidents of looting, assault, and rape, though officially prohibited, occurred with disturbing frequency, especially in the early days of occupation. The Soviet High Command recognized the need to impose discipline quickly. Punitive units were dispatched to crack down on misbehavior within the ranks. Red Army soldiers were ordered to avoid mistreating civilians and to support stabilization efforts. Political officers conducted daily briefings reinforcing ideological narratives of liberation and anti-fascist solidarity. At the same time, Soviet cultural and propaganda efforts increased, with banners, pamphlets, and public announcements emphasizing the victory over fascism and the restoration of peace. The appearance of Red Army choirs and concerts in public squares was part of a broader campaign to normalize the occupation and project an image of civilizational superiority. On the German side, adaptation took darker forms. Former Nazi officials either fled or attempted to disguise their identities. Some forged documents or posed as civilians, while others sought protection from the Western Allies by moving westward. The population in general entered a phase of passive adaptation, removing Nazi insignia, concealing affiliations, and focusing on basic survival. Civil servants, railway operators, and utility workers who had once served the Reich now cooperated with Soviet administrators, often out of necessity rather than ideology. The remnants of Vienna's resistance also adjusted their strategies. Anti-Nazi Austrians, who had previously operated in secrecy or fled the country, began returning and seeking roles in the post-war government. These individuals, often marginalized under Nazi rule, emerged as crucial intermediaries between the Red Army and the local population. Their cooperation allowed the Soviets to begin forming civilian councils and administrative bodies that could manage daily affairs while staying under military supervision. Culturally, the city began a slow reckoning with its identity. The destruction of the Nazi regime forced a confrontation with Vienna's complicity in the Reich. While some welcomed the Red Army as liberators, others saw them as merely the next occupiers. The psychological scars of years under totalitarian rule did not heal quickly. Many residents retreated into silence or denial, unwilling to process the enormity of the political shift. Others sought solace in religion, rebuilding church congregations and organizing community support networks amid the ruins. From a logistical standpoint, the Red Army adapted remarkably fast. Food convoys arrived from Hungary and Romania, redirected through secured corridors to supply both troops and civilians. Soviet Medical Corps established field hospitals and vaccinated against outbreaks of typhus and dysentery. Special units began inventorying cultural assets, including libraries, art collections, and archives, some of which were seized and transported east as war reparations. As the days turned into weeks, Vienna began to show the first signs of recovery under occupation. Trams resumed limited operation, bakeries reopened with Soviet-supplied flour, and postal services returned under military oversight. While the atmosphere remained tense and uncertain, the immediate collapse had been arrested. The city's population, staggered, traumatized, but resilient, was adapting to a new reality, one shaped not by ideology, but by the necessities of survival under foreign control. The Battle of Vienna may have ended in military terms, but its political and social aftershocks reverberated across the entire region. Soviet occupation had been achieved through force, but its permanence would depend on a different kind of campaign, one of governance, control, and the ability to shape post-war Austria into a compliant, if not willing, participant in the emerging new order of Central Europe. The true turning point in the Vienna offensive did not come with a single dramatic breakthrough or capitulation, but rather through the cumulative disintegration of the German military apparatus and the irreversible encirclement engineered by the Red Army. By early April 1945, the Wehrmacht's capacity to hold Vienna had eroded to the point of collapse. Soviet forces had bypassed fixed defenses, cut off escape routes, and overwhelmed each line of resistance through relentless pressure. But beyond the battlefield, the real shift occurred in the psychological and structural unraveling of Nazi control, not only over the city, but over Austria as a whole. In military terms, the Soviet pincer movements had done their work. German attempts to reinforce Vienna from the west through the Danube Valley and the Alpine foothills were thwarted. Soviet mechanized and armored formations blocked critical junctions near St. Pölten and Linz, preventing the redeployment of German reserve. Even elite units such as the 2nd SS Panzer Corps found themselves fragmented, undersupplied, and cut off from coordinated support. Hitler's refusal to allow tactical withdrawals only deepened the crisis. Instead of retreating to defend the Alpine Redoubt, a mythical last bastion in the mountains, German units were ordered to die in place, exhausting their strength in futile resistance. The death of Vienna's military defense thus came not from a final stand, but from strategic paralysis. General Rendulic, commander of Army Group South, had no effective means to alter the outcome. Communications were severed, and his authority undermined by the independent actions of SS commanders. With Berlin facing its own imminent destruction and the Reich collapsing on all fronts, Vienna was abandoned not by official decree, but by neglect and exhaustion. As Soviet troops stormed the final defensive positions, most remaining defenders had already accepted that victory was impossible. Surrender or death were the only options. For civilians, the turning point was equally stark. In the last week of fighting, thousands had already begun abandoning their homes, waving white flags from balconies, or emerging with hands raised to meet advancing Soviet patrols. Many Viennese, particularly those without political affiliation or those who had secretly opposed the Nazis, now saw survival as the only priority. The collapse of German civil authority led to spontaneous acts of resistance. Local citizens removed swastika banners, disarmed isolated German patrols, and in some cases guided Soviet troops through their own neighborhoods to avoid further destruction. This shift in civilian behavior was pivotal. Though not a coordinated uprising, the passive acquiescence and scattered cooperation of the population helped undermine the last vestiges of Nazi control. The Nazi Party infrastructure in Vienna, once a dominant presence in every neighborhood, effectively ceased to function. Party officials either fled or went into hiding. Volkssturm formations, hastily assembled and poorly armed, dissolved under pressure. Without local support or communications, their orders became meaningless. In effect, Vienna had ceased to be part of the Third Reich before the last bullets were fired. Meanwhile, the Soviet turning point was not only operational, but ideological. The Red Army saw the capture of Vienna as confirmation of its role not merely as a liberator, but as a force reshaping the post-war world. Marshal Tolbuchen's reports to Stavka emphasized both the military success and the political symbolism of Vienna's fall. The capture of Austria's capital gave the USSR leverage not only over Austria itself, but over the broader division of Europe. Unlike Berlin, which was destined for joint occupation, Vienna was now firmly within the Soviet sphere, taken solely by Soviet arms, secured through Soviet sacrifice. Within Soviet ranks, morale surged after the fall of the city. Units that had suffered brutal losses in Hungary and the Balkans now stood in the heart of Central Europe, victorious over one of the Reich's last urban strongholds. Decorations were distributed, battlefield promotions granted, and orders issued for rest and reorganization. Yet beneath the surface, exhaustion and trauma lingered. The cost had been high, and many soldiers understood that Vienna was not the end. Berlin awaited, and with it, the final confrontation. The political implications of the turning point began unfolding immediately. The establishment of the provisional government under Karl Renner, though portrayed as spontaneous, had been carefully orchestrated by Soviet political operatives. Renner's socialist credentials, his record of opposing fascism, and his connections to both pre-Nazi Austria and the Soviets made him a perfect figurehead. With Red Army protection, Renner's administration began asserting authority, even as many Austrians questioned its legitimacy. The turning point thus marked the beginning of Austria's post-war transition, but on Soviet terms. Internationally, Vienna's fall also sent a signal to the Western Allies. Though Austria had been included in post-war occupation planning, the reality on the ground now dictated that the Soviets held the capital. While US and British forces would later occupy their designated zones, the momentum and initiative belonged to the USSR. The diplomatic map of Europe was being redrawn not in conference halls, but in the shattered streets of cities like Vienna. where tanks and infantry decided who would govern whom. Perhaps most critically, the fall of Vienna crystallized a new reality for the German leadership. Even within the walls of the Führerbunker, Hitler's generals could no longer deny that the Reich's demise was inevitable. The loss of Vienna severed Germany's last strategic link to southeastern Europe, isolated remaining forces in the Balkans, and shattered any illusions of prolonging the war. The turning point of Vienna was, in effect, the death knell of Nazi ambition in Central Europe. Thus, the fall of Vienna was not just the loss of a city. It was the unraveling of an empire, the death of a regime, and the prelude to a new geopolitical order. The guns may have fallen silent, but the consequences of this turning point would echo across the decades that followed. As the guns fell silent in Vienna and the last embers of resistance were extinguished, the city entered a new phase, one not of liberation or immediate peace, but of occupation, reckoning, and painful transformation. The end of combat operations marked only the beginning of the struggle to rebuild from ruins, to reclaim identity, and to navigate the fractured political landscape left in the wake of total war. Soviet forces now fully controlled the Austrian capital, and with that control came a complex web of consequences, many of which would define Austria's fate for years to come. The withdrawal of combat units was gradual and selective. While frontline divisions were redeployed westward to support operations toward Linz and the German frontier, rear echelon formations remained behind to administer the city. The NKVD expanded its presence, setting up offices in key buildings, overseeing arrests, and conducting investigations into suspected Nazis, collaborators, and political enemies. Thousands were detained and deported to camps in the Soviet Union. Some were genuine perpetrators of war crimes. Others were caught in the sweep of suspicion, collateral victims of a system more focused on control than justice. The Soviet military government began implementing temporary administrative structures. Austrian citizens, many of whom had lived under the Nazi regime for nearly a decade, were invited or pressured to participate in rebuilding efforts under Soviet supervision. City services resumed slowly. Water and electricity were partially restored. Rationing was introduced, and emergency medical care continued. Red Army officers held daily briefings with selected Austrian officials to coordinate city management, though true autonomy was limited. Every action, from opening a bakery to printing newspapers, required Soviet approval. The city itself remained in a state of devastation. Vast sections of the outer districts were reduced to rubble. Entire tram networks lay twisted and inoperable, and bridges over the Danube remained either destroyed or structurally compromised. Cultural landmarks stood scarred, surviving but altered forever. The blackened facades of historic buildings testified to the urban inferno of April, and the Viennese who emerged from shelters did so into a world that no longer resembled the one they had known. Civilians were slow to return to normalcy. Trauma, hunger, and fear persisted. Funeral pyres burned in public squares. Rubble was cleared into makeshift memorials. Mass graves were hastily dug, while medical corps attempted to stem outbreaks of disease in overcrowded shelters. For the survivors, each day became an act of endurance, reconstructing homes, finding lost relatives, avoiding the attention of occupying authorities. The war had ended for them in one sense, but its weight pressed on in every street in silence. The Soviet presence, while stabilizing in some respects, came with mounting costs. Reports of violence against civilians, particularly sexual violence, continued to emerge, complicating the image of the Red Army as liberators. Although Soviet authorities issued orders to punish misconduct, enforcement was inconsistent. For many Viennese, the occupation was not experienced as freedom but as submission to a new, ideologically charged power that had replaced one form of absolutism with another. In the larger European context, the fall of Vienna was a harbinger of the coming division of the continent. The Allies, still coordinating through the mechanisms laid out at Yalta, faced the reality that military gains on the ground would define post-war influence more than diplomatic agreements. Although Austria was to be treated as a liberated, independent state, the reality of Soviet control over Vienna gave the USSR a dominant negotiating position. When the Western Allies finally entered their assigned zones later that year, they found that many key decisions had already been made. Yet even in these conditions, the seeds of Austria's future neutrality and independence were being planted. Karl Renner's provisional government, while born under Soviet protection, would later become a focal point for national reconstruction. As Cold War tensions mounted, Austria, unlike Germany, was not permanently divided, in part due to the shared understanding among occupying powers that its role could be that of a neutral buffer rather than a contested zone. The final consequence of the Vienna offensive then was neither fully Soviet dominance nor simple liberation. It was a layered, paradoxical outcome. Military victory wrapped in humanitarian catastrophe, political opportunity enmeshed in ideological control, and national rebirth tempered by foreign oversight. The fall of Vienna shattered the Nazi hold on Austria, but it did not bring peace in the traditional sense. Instead, it introduced a new chapter, one marked by uncertainty, compromise, and the long road to recovery. In retrospect, Vienna in April 1945 stood at the crossroads of war and peace, empire and autonomy, ruin and renewal. The offensive that had begun as a military operation ended as a foundational event in Austria's modern history. The price had been immense. Tens of thousands were dead, the city was broken, and an entire society had to confront not only what had been done to them, but what they had done, endured, and allowed. The guns were quiet, but the echoes of Vienna would continue to resound through the rubble of the 20th century.